So thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper. Let me jump into it. So there's been discussions about the effects of fiscal austerity on bond spreads and on the economy in general that have been at the center of recent policy debates during the euro debt crisis. Some policymakers and economists have claimed that fiscal austerity can be detrimental to the economy and lead to actually higher spreads. So what this paper is going to do is try to identify conditions under which fiscal austerity may not be effective in reducing spreads. That is, it can be self-defeating. And to do this, and what it's going to actually be finding is that those conditions are highly unlikely to occur. So for the analysis, Diego lays out a rich quantitative small open economy model with a strategic default in which output is demand determined. The key features are going to be, well, two productions, tradables and non-tradables, a downward weight rigidity, and of course, the government fiscal rules for spending and debt. And then using this model, he's going to run a counterfactual exercise to analyze the effects of austerity packages in Spain. So let me jump into the mechanism. I'm going to first show you what happens in the labor market. So here, probably many of you have seen this several times. So what we're going to be plotting is labor supply and demand as a function of wages. So here I'm assuming that the labor supply in red is fixed, and the labor demand by firms is in blue. So as the relative price of non-tradable drops, we're going to be having a shift downward of the labor demand. And in the economy that Diego has, because we have a lower bound on wages, we're going to not have wages fully adjusting. So we're not going to be having market clearing here, and as a result, we're going to end up in an economy with involuntary unemployment, as we can see here. So that means that changes in the relative price are going to lead to contractions in real GDP. Now the next question is, okay, how is fiscal policy able to affect this relative price? And to do that, we're going to look at the intratemporal optimality condition for households. So we're going to be replacing consumption of tradables and non-tradables by their respective resource constraints. This equation is going to be important. We're going to see here that the relative price of non-tradables is affected by a drop in government spending through three different channels. First, a reduction in non-tradable spending, then a reduction in tradable spending, and then a reduction in IOTA, which is the debt issuance. Now, the key question here is which one dominates. And given the assumption of same weights on non-tradables in the CS aggregators for private and public spending, we're going to be having that to a first order approximation, we're going to be having that the one that dominates is the reduction in debt issuance. And as a result, we're going to be having that following a drop in spending, the relative price is going to fall. Now, a question here is whether it would be good to see if this relationship between debt issuance, spending cuts, and the relative price of non-tradables is more or less in line with the data. That would be helpful to check. Now, let me bring your attention to some assumptions that can be affecting the effectiveness of spending in this economy. So the first one relates to the fact of whether we have a tax cut or a debt reduction following the drop in G. So if only taxes adjust, then as we could see in the previous equation I showed you, the relative price of non-tradables would remain the same. we would have a positive wealth effect on households, but the relative price of non-tradables wouldn't change. So that would be, important to have in mind. And this also highlights the importance of the parameter gamma G in the fiscal rule. Now, the second assumption I wanted to raise was regarding, households' access to borrowing. Here, Diego is assuming that households are hand-to-mouth agents, so the government has full control over private consumption, basically. Now, if we were letting households borrow from abroad and say that markets were complete, if we assume that the inverse of the intertemporal elasticity of substitution is equal to the coefficient of risk aversion, we could have it that in equilibrium, tradable consumption is not affected by fluctuations in non-tradable consumption and the government policies. Okay, so that would mean that the drop in G would increase the relative price of non-tradables through the lower non-tradable spending. Okay, so first the relative price would go up rather than down. Okay, and of course, the debt issuance channel wouldn't be there. Now, that's one extreme case. If we were having some form of incomplete markets and say we let households borrow through a non-state contingent bond, well, in that case, we would, as we could see in the equation below, we would have an additional term that's going to be the net bond proceeds from household. So by increasing debt, the households would be still able to contain the drop in the relative price of non-tradables. Okay, so these are some important features to have in mind for the effectiveness of fiscal policy. Now, my second comment relates to the fiscal consolidation in the future. So here it's important that we're having promised spending cuts in the future. That's why the role of the persistence is key. The focus of the paper has been on reducing the spreads through lowering default risk next period. That's basically by affecting the gap between the value of repayment and the value of defaulting. But another important issue to check here is the effect on next period bond prices when debt is long-term, as it is shown in this paper. Okay, then another important point to highlight is we could have that spending cuts tomorrow are state contingent, so we would only have them in certain, states of nature. This is important because Diego highlighted as well that the economic conditions tomorrow are key for the effectiveness of these policies. So this is something that the model could potentially accommodate. And the third issue here is, okay, what are the welfare implications of this? Can we conduct any normative analysis? I mean, here we're talking about reducing spreads, but is that necessarily optimal? In the example that Diego provided, we are cutting spreads tomorrow, but we're cutting spending tomorrow, but so are we today? And that is that can be having potentially adverse effects in the economy today that can be dominating. So to address these three issues, I'm gonna briefly go through a paper that I have with Javier Bianchi and Pablo Tonello. So here, what we conduct a similar exercise to the one that Diego has. We talk about this promised cuts in spending in the future as fiscal forward guidance. So we propose three types of fiscal consolidation. First one, where we're talking about current spending cuts. Second one is going to be committing to blunt spending cuts next period, which is basically what Diego has as well. And the third option is going to be well-designed spending cuts next period. That is, we're only going to be cutting spending when total income is within some range, okay, between Y lower bar and Y upper bar. And from the next period on, we're going to be assuming that the policy functions and value functions are all given by the Markov equilibrium. So here we report the main variables and welfare gains for the three different proposals. The first proposal in the first column shows that current consolidation can help reduce spreads. This is basically the debt effect that Diego was referring to, but clearly it's not going to be helping improve welfare. Now, if we promise future cuts and we combine that with more stimulus to today, we can be in a situation in which we would be reducing spreads, and the government today is going to be able to provide more stimulus by and reduce unemployment. So in that sense, we can be having positive welfare gains. Okay, and those welfare gains can be even larger if we concentrate the spending cuts tomorrow in certain states. And I'm gonna say a bit more about this in the next slides. So here we find that the gains from promising spending cuts tomorrow depend on the state today. Okay, this is also again in line with what Diego said, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the next slide, which basically focuses on the well-designed promised spending cuts. Again, these are cuts tomorrow that occur only to the extent that total income is within a range between Y lower bar and Y upper bar. So if we focus on the left panel, we see that the welfare gains are the highest when W lower bound is around 21 percentage points below the average Y. But we see that if we keep on lowering YW bar, Y lower bar, that it means that we would be conducting austerity in even more recessionary states. We would be seeing that the welfare gain falls. Okay, and this is in line with what Diego mentioned today. Now, what we find also here in this exercise is that when we look at the upper bar for income, we can have that the welfare gains also fall if spending is conducted in very good states as well. And the reason for that to happen is that in very good states, there's not much room to lower to improve bond prices tomorrow, because say that they are very close already to like the risk-free rate level. So spending cuts in those states wouldn't be helping. Okay.
Ignacio, you have like 2 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. So other comments I have are, so it would be nice to have a shock decompositions for the key variables. This is also echoing Juan Carlos' point that, for example, maybe, there's some persistence in some shocks, like in the fiscal rules that the model might be missing right now. There's also some potential concerns for model misspecification. The structure for the fiscal rules is somewhat rigid, and it does not allow for asymmetric responses of spending to debt and GDP. And well, in this other paper with Javier and Pablo, we find that optimal policy may prescribe stimulus in certain states of the economy and austerity in some others. So it would be nice if we could have rules that accommodate that case. And then from the quantitative perspective, well, Diego uses a preference shock, right, for mainly computational reasons. Now, it would be nice to see how economically meaningful this shock is. I know that the variance of it is very small, but it would be nice to see, okay, how many defaults this exogenous shock is actually triggering. And if we look at, for example, the picture of spreads, we see that the spreads are quite high way before the debt crisis, and there's a significant gap in there. And I wonder whether, to what extent this is due to the preference shock that still is causing certain default events, and how much of it is actually due to the fact that we're having, long-term debt, and spreads can still be seizable even though default in the near future is not that much. Okay, so to conclude, I find this paper very interesting. It's on a very important topic, policy relevant topic. I have to say that the analysis is very carefully done, and I think that the quantitative framework here is suitable to analyze optimal phasing of fiscal consolidations, whether it's optimal to front load the adjustments in spending or backloading them, making the adjustments more gradual. I think that the model is rich enough for this kind of analysis. And the main takeaway here is that in this paper is that the conditions for self-defeating austerity look quite unlikely. That's it.
Thank you, Ignacio. I have a question from Javier Bianchi. Javier, it's mute. You are muted. Good.
So this is a great paper. I really like. So one question I have is why you model the fiscal shock as a generalized spending cut across tradables and non-tradables, given that we know that the positive multipliers are really in the non-tradable sector. So in some sense, you're making your life a little bit more harder for the government to have basically, a sort of stimulus to be a good thing for spread. And and then the other question I have is more of a general question of whether we think that the austerity should apply to states of the world where the government defaults. It seems perhaps more plausible to assume that all the spending cuts are sort of off the table once the government defaults. And this is important for the mechanism, because by affecting spending under default, you end up affecting spreads. So putting these things together, it seems that on one hand you're making your life a bit harder, but on the other hand, you are perhaps giving a better chance for the government when you impose some promises also under default.
Thank you, Javier. We have a last question by Enrique Mendoza. Enrique, welcome.
Hey, Joaquin, it's good to see you. Yeah, it was a very interesting paper. I have a question / comment. So the part that has the lump sum taxes, the transfers, lump sum taxes or transfers, closing the budget constraint, seems innocuous, but when you think about it, what it really means is it's almost like there is a possibility to have some form of domestic financing, because in these kinds of models, these transfers, you can think of it as if you have domestic debt. It's a transfer or a tax between whoever is the domestic agent and the government that is filling in the gap here. So it would be interesting. I know it would be too much to say, okay, now we want to add domestic debt into the model and then see how this interacts with the incentives to default on the external debt, and whether you have discrimination between the domestic and the foreign debt when you default and all that. But maybe at least you can do a robustness or an extension where you impose some limitation on the use of this lump sum tax, or you try to introduce a distortionary tax as a way to close the model. And examine how that changes the results that it produces. With this caveat that the way it is now is as if you can essentially at the end close the model with some implicit placement of domestic debt.
Thank you, Enrique. Diego, you have like 5 minutes to.
Yeah, thank you, Enrique. Thank you very much for that comment. Exactly that. The T when I go to the data is a mixture between net taxes and domestic debt issuance. Totally. So yeah, I mean, would be a nice extension of the model to add some limitation to that thing. I mean, to incorporate that problem into the model in a. I'm gonna have to think about it, but it's a nice comment. Thank you. Thank you very much for all the comments. I mean, 5 minutes is very difficult. There is a lot of food for thought, but let me start with the last ones because those are Javier. The reason I'm doing that, why is austerity on G's only, is mainly for data limitations. I don't know, maybe you know, but I didn't find a good series of government spending in non-tradables and tradables. It's kind of tricky to do that division. So then I went for the safest thing to do and do it all together. That's the main reason. And on the issue of why I mean, there are several things. The point of adding government spending to the utility function, I think, is well taken. I have a prior that, at least for the evolution of the spreads, it's not going to matter much, but I don't know. So it's something to test. Thank you, Juan Carlos, and Ignacio. You said something about that too. Then let me highlight one thing, that's why I'm using these fiscal rules. I think they are important in the analysis for several reasons. One is, again, it allows me to, as Juan Carlos said, to define austerity. But then, given that I'm using this fiscal rule, then the model incorporates as an exogenous state the government spending, and that allows me to do a nice mapping between what happens between the government spending and spreads and economic activity. Given that it's an exogenous state, I can simply do exogenously change the government spending and see the impact of that in the economy. I think it's important.
From an empirical point of view, going back to the issue of government expenditures and the division between tradables and non-tradables,
yeah,
perhaps empirically would be a more relevant avenue to divide government expenditures into hours, employment, and goods. And then what you do with goods, you know, it's second order.
Okay. I think that's a nice idea. So you mean that hours? You mean the wage bill of the government?
Yeah, exactly. It's, the biggest chunk of government expenditure is employment.
Yes, that will be non-tradable, and the rest will be tradable. Something like that.
Something like that.
Okay. Thanks. That's useful. Yeah, I don't know what I was saying, but yeah, on the fiscal rule, I mean, having a fiscal rule allows me this mapping between government spending and spreads and economic activity, and it also introduces these parameters, which I think are clean and are important, determining the fiscal multipliers, and highlighting something that I think is important. Well, there are several things to incorporate. The answer about the utility cost of default, for the last calibration, I have no idea whether it's that important or not on the spreads. It used to be not really important because the variance of that shock is very low, but I have to do it again. I have to check it again, but my priority is that it's not really important on the spread. And that the high spreads before the spike, they have to do with a long-term debt feature of the model. Yeah, and then regarding the choice of Spain, yeah, I can apply the model to any other country. I think that's a good suggestion. The reason why I chose Spain is that. Maybe it is a very short time, but the austerity package was really, really important. So the shock is really, really important, and I thought that was a good choice. But definitely, I could apply the model to any other austerity episode in emerging economies and carry out this analysis the same way. Thank you. Very nice comments, and definitely a lot of things to do.
Well, thank you very much, Diego. Thank you very much also, Agustin, and all the commentators and people who ask for questions.